Hi, Archie.
Hi.
Are you happy to be back home?
Yes.
Did you have a nice vacation?
Yes.
Do you wish it was longer, or are you glad to be home?
I wish it is longer.
I know, you had a really nice time, especially the place right on the beach, right? So pretty, and the sailing, really fun.
Yes.
Your mom knows how to plan a great vacation.
Yes.
All righty, let me go ahead and share my screen with you. Here it is. So last time we were talking about the cedar tree and evergreen trees. Let me get rid of our blue star here. And so we are at a super exciting part of this story because even though Jack spilled the entire goblet of the water of memory and imagination, it turned into that golden cloud, which just rose up through the room. And then all of a sudden, everyone is unfrozen and laughing, and the sense, remember this word sense? It's a little bit hard to say this word right here. It's just scent. But if you want to make it plural, meaning more than one scent, you would say sense, sense. And then it almost sounds like this word here, but this is a completely different word. So I will erase that. So the scents of cedar smoke, evergreen, roses, and almonds, all good scents that often remind people of Christmas time. So we have this laughter that's growing louder, and Jack saw King Arthur and Queen Guinevere looking at one another, and they were laughing, and the knights of the round table were laughing too. Oh, and the white dove came in. It soared across the dark room like a bright light and then swooped back out into the night. Okay, so now we're gonna continue. I think that's where we got last time. Best of all, Jack saw Morgan Le Fay smiling at him and Annie. Jack, Annie, come here, she called. She held out her arms. If someone holds out their arms, they want you to come and give them a big hug. Morgan, cried Annie. She ran to Morgan and threw her arms around the enchantress. Jack stood up, still holding the empty cup. He ran to Morgan and hugged her too. Morgan is very special to Jack and Annie. We did what the Christmas night told us to do, said Annie. We brought back the water of memory and imagination. But I dropped the cup, said Jack, and spilled all the water. I still can't believe he did that. But the water made a gold cloud, said Annie, and everyone came back to life. Morgan laughed with amazement. Amazement is like, wow, I just can't believe it. That is amazing. You have just returned from the other world? She asked. Yes, said Annie. A white stag brought us back, said Jack. He turned to King Arthur. Your Majesty, he said, we have good news. Your knights are safe. Sir Lancelot said to tell you they will be home before the first night of the new year. The king looked bewildered. Bewildered is a word that means kind of confused. He says, you found them? Yes, and they are all fine, said Annie. Here, said Jack. He handed the silver cup to the king. Please give this back to Sir Galahad. And this to Sir Lancelot, said Annie. She took the glass key from around her neck and gave it to King Arthur. Oh, and this to Sir Percival, said Jack. He pulled the wooden compass box from his pack and gave it to the king. At first, King Arthur was too stunned to speak. Stunned means just very surprised. Then he clapped his hands and laughed joyfully. Thank you, he said to Jack and Annie. Boy, it sure is nice to see the word joyfully. We have not seen that in Camelot very much in this story. The knights of the Round Table all cheered, like, hooray! Ring the bells, King Arthur shouted. Call the people of Camelot to the castle. Dun, 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 dun. They have already gathered outside the doors, Your Majesty, said a page. Now this page is not the page of a book. This would be a person's job at the castle he's kind of like an assistant. Bring them in, said King Arthur. We must rejoice together. My red dot got stuck. There we go. We must rejoice together. Queen Guinevere smiled at Jack and Annie. Her eyes sparkled now. Once again, you have helped save Camelot, she said. Thank you very much. You're welcome, said Jack and Annie together. Then Jack heard the sounds of children talking and laughing. He turned to see a crowd of people streaming through the arched doorway of the great hall. They carried candles, a giant fir tree, and boughs of holly and pine. Now I want to show you, this would be a giant fir tree. What do you think they might be doing with this if they are carrying it in?
Oh, I know, the Christmas tree.
They're going to decorate a Christmas tree, and this would be a bough of holly. That word bough. Now, this is not this word bow. This word bow is what you would do in front of a king, or when you want to show someone great respect and you kind of lean forward and you stand up and you're bowing. But there's another word bow, which has this O-U-G-H digraph, and it's making the sound ow. Now the O-U-G-H is a really tricky digraph. I'm using this word digraph. A digraph, remember, is when two or more letters are making one sound. The O-U-G-H digraph can actually make six sounds, and ow is one of them. So b-ow, bow. And what it means is a branch of a tree, especially a lower branch of a tree. So here you can see this is a branch with these little red berries on it and the green leaves. This is called a bough of holly. And it's a very Christmassy kind of plant because I think of the red and green. And we often use those colors, red and green, when we are decorating for Christmas. So let's see. Musicians followed them with stringed instruments. As everyone started to decorate the hall, the musicians began playing and singing a beautiful Christmas carol. That's a song. Jack, said Annie, look. The white stag was standing in the arched doorway. Remember, an arched doorway, instead of it being a square, it has a round top. Jack turned excitedly to Morgan. See that white stag, he said. He took us to the other world. See him? Morgan smiled. Yes, I do see him, she said. And now I see everything. Who do you see?
The white stag is Merlin.
Merlin is a little bit hard to say because we have an L in it in the middle. So if you split this into two parts, this would be Merlin. And then this part, well, the I is going to really be a short I, it. So it's Merlin. Yep, Merlin. Jack looked back at the doorway. The stag was gone. In his place stood an old man with a long white beard. He held a staff and wore a flowing red cloak. The same cloak Jack and Annie had worn on their quest, and that Annie had given back to the stag. Who is that? Jack asked. That is Merlin, the magician, said Morgan. It was Merlin who invited you here. I see that now. Merlin, said Jack. He sent us the royal invitation? Yes, said Morgan. Then he put the rest of us under a spell and he carried you to the other world. No, said Annie, the Christmas night put you under a spell. And the white stag carried us to the other world, said Jack. Morgan smiled. Merlin was both the Christmas night and the white stag, she said. Remember, he's a magician, not a mortal. This word mortal is a little bit of a interesting word. This word mortal just refers to a human being. And something about a human being, a person, is that we have a day when we are born and we have a day when we die. So we have a life on earth where we have a birthday and then we live our life on earth. And then there is a day when we die, for our life on earth is over. And so because of that, because we don't live forever and ever and ever on earth, we are mortal. So mortal means we can die. Our body on earth can die. The word, if you put an I am in front of that, immortal, it means someone who cannot die. Okay, so we would say, for example, that God is immortal because he cannot die. So mortal is what a word we use to describe a person or a human being. Now, a magician, we have to remember, is a part of, I'm not talking about a magician on earth where you can go to watch a magician have a magic show who has learned magic tricks. In this book, which is a fantasy book, a magician is someone who can do real magic, and that is fiction. That is part of a fantasy genre of stories. So just like a fantasy genre might have wizards and witches and elves, trolls, dwarves, goblins, it will also have magicians, but these are fictional characters that are from the author's imagination. And so in the fantasy genre, you might have characters who are immortal, which means they cannot die. But we just have to remember this is a fictional world. That's a fictional idea, which means not real. So because So again, remembering that this is not real, we have to remember the difference between real and fantasy. So a magician, they're saying, can change his shape whenever he wishes. So he can change his shape into being a white stag or change his shape into being the Christmas night. Oh, wow, whispered Annie. Why did Merlin do these things? Asked Jack. Merlin was angry when King Arthur banished magic from Camelot. Remember, banished says we may not have any more magic here ever again. I will not allow it in Camelot ever again. It may not be here. It is banished, said Morgan. I see now he finally took matters into his own hands. This is kind of an expression. To take matters into your own hands means that you are not going to be a team player. You are not going to ask other people, what is your opinion? What do you think we should do? Let's have a vote on it. Let's work on solving this together. Instead, you're going to say, I'm just going to handle this all by myself. with my idea and fix it. And I don't care what anyone else thinks. That's what it means to take matters into your own hands. That's usually not a very good idea, but that's what Merlin did. How, said Jack. He knew King Arthur would send no more knights to the other world for the water of memory and imagination, said Morgan. Remember, King Arthur didn't want to lose any more knights. He already lost Sir Lancelot, Sir Galahad, and Sir Percival. So I assume he brought you. So here, this is Morgan talking. And she says, so I assume he would be Merlin, brought you, Jack and Annie, to Camelot, hoping that you, Jack and Annie, would offer to go instead. So we can see there's a lot of pronouns here, and we always have to pay attention to the pronouns when we're reading to make sure we know what is she talking about, right? So this one is Morgan.
Morgan.
This one is Merlin.
Merlin.
And this one is Jack and Annie.
Jack and Annie.
And we've talked about this word before, assume. Assume is when you believe something is true, even if you don't know for sure. So she says, I assume he brought you to Camelot, hoping that you would offer to go instead of more knights. And then Annie said, why did he want us to go? I want you to notice on this page, there is a lot of italics. And so you can hear me emphasizing them when I'm reading, right? It was Merlin. Let me use pink for this. It was Merlin who invited you here. Merlin, said Jack, he sent us, and the white stag carried us. The Christmas night put you under a spell. So all of these italics in here, we need to really slow, we want to stretch out that word to emphasize it. So why did he want us to go? Asked Annie. Merlin has often heard my tales of your adventures in the treehouse, said Morgan. He knows you both have a great desire to fight for the good, and he knows you use the gift of imagination very well. Those are two special qualities needed to succeed in any quest. Jack and Annie looked back at Merlin. From far across the room, the white-bearded magician smiled at them. He raised his staff, then he slipped out the door. So I think when he raised his staff, it was his way of saying thank you. Did you see here the two special qualities? One is the great desire to fight for the good, and the other is to use the gift of imagination very well. And so she's saying that these two qualities, one is their desire to fight for the good, and the other one is to use the gift of imagination very well. And those two special qualities are needed if you want to succeed at any quest or any mission or any goal that you might have. I like how she calls imagination a gift, right? That's when we discover something special about ourselves, about how we are made. That is a gift to us, that we people, we have an imagination, and when we discover it, just like opening up a gift and use it, it's a really special quality. Quality. Jack looked around the great hall. All the candles and torches were lit now. A fire blazed in the hearth. The musicians were playing. Everyone was singing. The room glowed with warm firelight and rosy faces. At last, Christmas in Camelot was just as Jack had imagined it would be. The spell of the dark wizard had been broken. The great hall was filled with beauty and love and joy and light. There are so many special words on this page. When we think of Camelot at the very beginning, back when Jack and Annie first arrived, it was cold, but now there's a fire that's blazing in the hearth. The candles and the torches were lit. It was dark, it was dim, it was dimly lit, but now it's bright because all the candles are lit. It's warm because the fire is blazing in the hearth. Instead of it being quiet and silent, there's musicians who are playing. People are singing. The faces, instead of looking sad, they are rosy faces. And so now when they look around the room, they can see that it's filled with beauty, love, joy, light. These four qualities, beauty and love and joy and light, had not been there at the beginning of the story. So it's a really great kind of ending to their time in Camelot. And then we have our final chapter. This is called Welcome Home. Wake up, Jack, said Annie. Jack opened his eyes. He was lying in the dark on the wooden floor of the treehouse. Through the window, he saw the cloudy sky above the Frog Creek woods. Time to go home, said Annie. Oh, I must have fallen asleep, said Jack. I had the most incredible dream. I dreamed that we went to Camelot. It was Christmas, and Merlin. That wasn't a dream, said Annie. It was real. You fell asleep at the round table during the party. King Arthur carried you to the treehouse, and I made the wish for us to come home. Jack sat up. Seriously? He whispered. Seriously, she said. Jack, Annie, their mom called in the distance. Coming, Annie shouted out the treehouse window. She turned to Jack. Let's go. I mean, seriously? It really happened? Jack asked Annie again. Yes, really, she said. She held up the royal invitation. See? Proof. Oh, yeah, he whispered. This time, the letter M stood for Merlin, not Morgan, said Annie. Jack smiled. Thanks, Merlin, he said softly. Jack picked up his backpack. Then he and Annie started down the rope ladder and headed home. As they walked through the deep December twilight, twilight is sort of that dim color near right after the sun is setting and the sky is getting darker. Snowflakes started to fall. By the time they left the woods and headed down their street, snow was swirling everywhere. Ahead, they could see their house glowing with lamplight. Their mom was waiting on their front porch. Hi, Mom, said Annie. Hi, Mom, said Jack. Hi, kids. Did you have a good day? She asked. Yeah, said Jack. Pretty good, said Annie. I'm glad, said their mom. Welcome home. She held the door open and Jack and Annie slipped inside. Their house felt extra warm and cozy. Good smells came from the kitchen. Jack and Annie took off their snow-covered jackets, then headed up the stairs. In the hallway, Annie turned to Jack. Merry Christmas, she said simply. Merry Christmas, he said. Annie slipped into her room and Jack into his. Jack closed his door and sat on his bed. He took his notebook out of his pack and opened it. His spirits sank. You know, we talked about how your spirits can be lifted and they can soar, but if they sink, it means that you are disappointed or you go from being really excited to sad. His spirits sank, except for the 3 rhymes. He had taken no notes on their journey not one. And this is not like Jack, right? Exhausted, that means very, very tired, Jack lay back on his bed. He squeezed his eyes shut. He tried to remember the details of their adventures in Camelot and the other world. He could feel the terrible chill in the great hall when Morgan was frozen. He could hear the joyful music as the winged dancers danced around in their circle. He could taste the sweet, bitter, spicy taste of the water of memory and imagination. Jack sat up. All at once, he felt very awake. He turned to a clean page in his notebook. He grabbed his pencil and wrote. It all started when we saw the white dove in the twilight. Using his memory and his imagination, Jack kept writing, doing his part to keep the legend of King Arthur, the Knights of the Round Table, Merlin, and Morgan Le Fay alive. As the snow swirled outside his window, Jack wrote and wrote and wrote. He didn't stop writing until he had written down the whole story, his story of their Christmas in Camelot. This was a great story, and there's a couple things I want to note on this page. He was worried that he would not remember this story because he had not taken any notes. But what he remembered were a lot of the things that his senses had experienced during this adventure. Your senses, we have 5 of them: what we can smell, what we can see, what we can hear, what we can taste, and what we can feel. And so look at what his senses remembered. His senses remembered the terrible chill, how cold it had been when Morgan was frozen. He could hear, that was feel, so he could feel the terrible chill. He could hear the joyful music, so that's what he could hear with his ears. He could taste the sweet, bitter, spicy taste of the water of memory and imagination. So what he's remembering is what he could feel, what he could hear, what he could taste. I think that it's interesting that this whole story had been about a quest to get the water of memory and imagination. And then what does he use? But he uses his memory and imagination to write down the story that he remembers. I also found it was interesting that the water of memory and imagination was not just sweet, but it was also bitter, and it was also spicy. Those are 3 different tastes. We don't usually say that a drink is both sweet and bitter, or sweet and spicy. We usually pick one. But this water of memory and imagination had a little bit of sweet, a little bit of bitter, and a little bit of spicy. And I think maybe that's because memory is of our experiences, and not every experience in life is sweet and wonderful. Some of them are hard. Some of them are exciting. Some of them are disappointing. Some of them are sad. Some of them are full of love and joy. Some of them are hard. And so experiences are all different, kind of the range of tastes that we might have. And so when the author described how the taste of that water, how the water of memory tasted in these different ways, I think that was really interesting. The other thing I noticed is that right here it says he was doing his part to keep the legend of King Arthur alive. And that reminds me back at the beginning of the story, if I can find it. Oh, here we go. Okay. So back here, this was early in the story. Morgan is saying, the story of Camelot is a legend. And then she says, a legend is a story that begins in truth, but then imagination takes over. This is the first place where the author is talking about the importance of imagination. Morgan says, different people in different times tell the story. they use their imaginations to add new parts. That is how a legend is kept alive. So this is where she makes a reference to keeping a story alive. So the story of Camelot is a legend, and the way that story is kept alive is by different people at different times telling their story, using their imaginations to add new parts. And that is what Jack is doing at the very end. Come all the way down here to the end. It says that he's using his imagination, doing his part to keep the legend of King Arthur and Camelot alive by writing down his story, his experience. That is he adding his part. And here he is. He looks a little older than he did in the other Magic Treehouse stories. Here's a note from the author. Let's see what she says here. Many people believe that the legend of King Arthur was inspired by an actual military leader who led Britain over 1,500 years ago. That's 1,500. Imaginary stories about the adventures of King Arthur were first told in Wales and Ireland. That's next to the country of England. These stories are called Celtic myths. Sadly, most Celtic myths are lost to us forever. I don't know if this is Celtic or Celtic. Celtic, might be Celtic. Sadly, most Celtic myths are lost to us forever because only a few were written down. Many details in my story about King Arthur's realm are drawn from details in the few Celtic stories that have survived through the ages. The cloak that makes one invisible was considered to be one of the 13 treasures of Britain. Britain is another name for England. Great Britain. So it'd be England and Wales and Ireland, I think. I don't know if that also includes Scotland or not. Merlin the magician was said to keep the treasures in a glass tower. None of the magic of the treasures would work for a person who was unworthy to use them. The white stag was inspired by a supernatural Celtic beast that often led humans to a hidden other world. The idea for the cauldron of memory and imagination came from a 6th century poem. The poem tells a story about King Arthur and his knights traveling to a hidden world and searching for a magical cauldron of poetry and inspiration. Many knights never returned from that dangerous quest. In the 12th century, Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine encouraged poets and troubadours to make up more stories about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table to inspire her people. In the following years, storytellers all over Europe told heroic tales of King Arthur, Merlin, Sir Lancelot, Queen Guinevere, and Morgan Le Fay. French poets were the first to call the imaginary kingdom Camelot. The storytellers of the Middle Ages blended elements of Christianity with the old Celtic myths. In their stories, miracles and marvels often took place around Christian holidays. Christmas in Camelot was a time of joyous celebration. And then she signs her name, Mary Hope Osborne. Here she mentions the 12th century, and here she mentions the 6th, it's hard to say that word, 6th century. Let me just explain to you how they figure out when that is. So if we have a timeline, and if we call this 0, and we're down here in 2021, but if we go back to 0, then from 0 to 100, this part right here, these 99 years from 0 to 100, this is called right here the first century. A century is 100 years. It's a group of 100 years would be a century. So from 0 to 100 is the first century. And then if we go from there to 200, then this right here, this would be from 101 to 200. This would be the second century. So if we wanted to go to the 6th century, I think I need to get rid of 2021 for a minute. Okay, so let's see. This could be 300. So then this would be the 3rd century. And then this would be 400. So this would be the 4th century. And then this would be 500. So this would be the 5th century. And then this one would be 600. So this would be the 6th. Boy, it's sure hard to say that. 6 would be S-I-X, and then we have to add a T-H. And so think of all these sounds you have to say, because the X is the sound of the K-S. It's a K. So you actually would have to say an S-I, short I, and then the K, and then the together. So you'd have to go and put that all together. 6. That's tricky to do. So the 6th century would be right in here, from 501 to 600, those years after 0. So we would count century 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You know, when we say 6th century, we might think that we're talking about the 600s, but actually we're not. We're talking about from 500 or from 501 to 600, because the 1st century is from 0 to 100. So the 1st century is less than 100. And so the 6th century is between 500 and 600. It's not higher than 600. That's easy to get confused about. Okay, well, this was a really fun story. Thank you for picking this one out. Say so long.
And I'll say choo-choo-choo.
Bye, Archie.
Bye.
Hi, Archie. We have finished this story, Christmas in Camelot, and I was looking at some notes I had been taking and saw that there are a few words that I wanted to explain the meaning more clearly, and also one thought I had, something I noticed at the very end of the story that I wanted to mention. So let me share my screen with you. So here we saw at the end of the story, or right before Jack and Annie returned to Frog Creek, it says, "The great hall was filled with beauty and love and joy and light." So you can see that the author used the word "and" 1, 2, 3 times. Okay, here, here, and here. Now, the author could have written that sentence like this. So you see, in the way that I show you here, we have a list of 4 things. We have beauty, love, joy, and light. And so here we have these 4 things. 1, 2, 3, and 4. And when we make a list of 4 things, we can call that a series. A series is when we have 3 or more things in a list. And what we can do is we could have thing number 1 followed by a comma. And then we would have thing number 2 followed by a comma. And then we would have thing number 3 followed by a comma. And then we would have the word and. So you can see thing number 1, comma, thing number 2, comma, thing number 3, comma, the word and then thing number 4. This would be a series. The great hall was filled with beauty, love, joy, and light. But the author didn't write it that way. The author wrote it like this. The great hall was filled with beauty and love and joy and light. So we, the reader, might ask the question, why did the author do that? The author didn't have to do that. The author could have written it with commas in a series. How come the author used the word and 3 times? I think the reason the author did that is because she really wanted to emphasize these 4 things. Maybe joy is what had been stolen at the beginning, but in the end, not only is joy returned, but the hall, the castle, is filled also with beauty and love and light. Those other things in addition to joy. So these 4 things. And by putting and in between each one, it is really bringing our attention as the reader to each one of these individually. We are not just seeing a list of things where the word can get lost in the list as though, almost like they're just saying the same thing 4 times. She is really emphasizing each of these 4 things because they are important. Something else that the author can do to emphasize things is use italics. We have talked about that. And when she uses italics, she is emphasizing that word or idea. Okay, a couple of the words I wanted to mention that we have talked about. One is the word timeless. This was a word we talked about when we were in the other world and Jack and Annie found the circle of musicians and fairies that were dancing and just could not stop dancing. Timeless has this suffix less. And less means without, which means you don't have it. So if we look at time, okay, the passage of time, time always keeps moving, right? Time does not stand still. Time always keeps moving. So if something is timeless and it does not have time, what does that mean? Well, we say that something is timeless if while time keeps marching on, that one thing does not change. It's almost like time does not affect it. So even though time keeps moving, that thing we're describing just looks like it stays the same, stays unchanged. We might say it doesn't have a beginning and an end. It's just always the same, unchanged by the passage of time. Okay, we also talked about the scents of cedar, roses, almonds. So one scent, which is the smell, how something smells, should be one scent. The C is silent. We do not go sk, sk, skent, because this E after the C makes the C sound like an S, but we already have an S, so we don't go s, s. The C just actually doesn't make any sound in this word. It's just scent. So a scent is the aroma or smell of something. And if we have more than one scent, we had an S at the end, and then it's a little tricky to say scents. Actually, the way that we say it is exactly the same as this word. So if we have more than one scent right here, we say it the same way as scents. Scents, scents. They're the same sound. We had also talked about our senses. I would have to add an S here to show more than one of these. When we're talking about this word sense as a noun, as a thing, we are talking about our 5 senses, our sense of sight, of being able to see, of hearing, of being able to hear, of smelling, of tasting, and of touching. Those are our senses. The word sense, here in green, can also be about common sense. Common sense is just using our brain to be able to tell what is a good idea and what's not, without having to do too much thinking about it. Just saying, yeah, oh, it's cold outside, well, then we should wear a jacket. That's common sense. We can say something doesn't make sense. That means we just can't figure it out. For example, if I tried to read a book in Chinese, I would look at it and I would say, this does not make sense to me. I can't figure it out. So sense here in green has a few different meanings. But in the chapter where we had the sense of Christmas with the evergreen trees, the cedar, the roses and almonds, that was also the chapter where we were talking about our sense of sight and sound and taste and smell and touch. In a fantasy genre, we might talk about put something under a spell. Well, in the fantasy genre, if there are witches, wizards, enchantresses, then maybe they are really putting you under a spell, which means using magic, which we have to remember is pretend, right? It's in a fiction story, like a fantasy story. So if you put someone under a spell, there is magic used. In this story, Camelot had been put under a spell. The joy had been taken from it. We do use this phrase, put under a spell, in English for nothing that has to do with magic. There are kind of some fancy words that have this meaning. One is to be captivated. These are some pretty fancy words. Another one would be enthralled. Enthralled. One that's a little bit easier would be fascinated. There's that C again, not making any sound at all. Fascinated. We could have as an example that maybe there is a ballet, a dance, a performance, an orchestra playing, something on stage. They're performing, and the audience is sitting in their seat watching them. Well, we could say that the entire audience was under a spell as they watched the performance. That just means they were captivated by it. They were enthralled by it. They were fascinated by it. They couldn't take their eyes off of it. They didn't want to look at their phone and text someone or turn to their neighbor and talk about something. They just couldn't stop watching it, couldn't stop listening. They were just so interested in it and captivated by it, enthralled by it. So that would be a use of put under a spell that has nothing to do with magic. We also heard the word quality. Quality has a few different meanings. One of them is if you're talking about is something of good quality or bad quality. We want to buy things and use things that have good quality. They are not going to fall apart easily. They are not broken. They are not damaged. We prefer to use things that have good quality. They're going to last and be useful and do what they're supposed to do, and we can depend on them. When we're talking about the qualities of a person, we're talking about their characteristics. Well, characteristics, that's a very long word, begins with the word character. So we can think of a character as a person, and then we add istics. Characteristics would be the attributes or aspects of a person that tell us what kind of person they are. We could say that the person has qualities of being a good leader, of being kind, of being brave and resourceful and compassionate and helpful, hardworking, persevering, generous, caring, thoughtful. These are characteristics or qualities of a person that are really inspiring. They're great. They are setting a good example for others. And the last one I want to mention is the word assume. We talked about this one a few times. This also goes with the word assumption. Assume is when we believe something even though we don't have proof. We might have no proof. We can't prove it, but we believe it anyway. We just are so sure it's true, we don't need to prove it. And we could easily be wrong. Assumptions are often wrong, but sometimes we just are confident that we know. Okay, so those are the last few things that I wanted to talk about in regards to Christmas in Camelot. We will have one final video about Christmas in Camelot in which I show how to do some writing about the story. So I really enjoyed reading this story with you, and I'm looking forward to our next book. We will be doing a Minecraft book called Deep Dive.